Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now Red Dead Redemption 1 has finally made its way to PC 14 years after it came to PS3 and Xbox 360. For a bit more context, I was 15, almost 16 when it released, and now I'm 30. But woo, I made it and now I get to experience it on PC, something I always wanted to do. This also gives me a chance to test out the game on hardware that cost me less than the game, because here they're charging £40 for this. You get Red Dead and the Undead Nightmare expansion, which is definitely worth a play. Both are. It's a fantastic game because this is an old game that's also new. It has like new features like FSR3 for example, and runs with DX12, but at the same time it's still old underneath all that, so it still runs on some pretty ancient hardware. And as you can see here, I've started with the GTX 960, a 2GB GDDR5 GPU from back in 2015, and we're running at ultra here first of all with at least 60 frames per second. I'd actually recommend dropping too high, as you'll see in a minute as we make our way towards Armadillo here. The frame rate does dip slightly below 60. It's fine if you want to play with at least 30 FPS, you can still do that with the ultra settings, but in order to pretty much hit at least 60 FPS across the board, even with an old card like this, high settings are better. So I'll do that now. We're going to the options. So you can see we have a max frame rate of 144 FPS, and you might think no chance on a 962 gig, but we actually can hit this sometimes when we're in the middle of nowhere on horseback, which is quite surprising to be fair. But again, this is a 2010 game originally. Here we are in Armadillo then. I've dropped things to the high settings where we're going to see at least 60 frames per second. I'm just going to borrow this fella's horse here. Excuse me, sir. That got me an instant bounty. John, that is not how you ride a horse. What are you doing? What is going on? Alright, I've noticed a few bugs. John, what is this? Is this some sort of outlaw way of riding a horse so you can hide underneath it in the long grass and escape the law? I'll show you what I meant earlier about the 144 FPS cap. We're not quite hitting it here, but outside of town we're going to see well over 100. This is with the high settings here on a 960, which by the way cost me £28, I believe it was, from CEX. 28 quid for the 2GB version. The game cost me £39.99 on Steam. Price wise, I think a few of you are going to be conflicted. If you've played this before, either on the PS3 360 or on PS4 or whatever else it's come to recently, I wouldn't recommend getting it again on PC. If it's for the first time, it's well worth an experience. The open world, the characters, the story. I may be a bit biased, it's one of my favourite games, but then you've got the Undead Nightmare expansion as well. So I think both games are very much worth a play. There's nothing quite like the original Red Dead in my opinion, but I understand why some of you may be a little put off by the price, which I'm sure will drop over the next few months. So I'm heading back to town now. As you can see, our frame rate will dip from 100 frames per second back down to sort of 80, 70. I haven't got any exact figures on screen for you today because it's a bit all over the place. I am very early on in the game, and I'm sure as we make our way through this title and across the map, the performance will differ. But I can pretty confidently say that even with a 2GB 960, we're going to see at least 60 frames per second pretty much all of the time. I don't know about you, but I think it still holds up quite well visually as well. It was a pretty good looking game back then, and I think it still looks half decent. Some of the effects and the atmosphere, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to sell it to you, that's one thing I don't want to do, but it's just a really enjoyable game. I think it's held up well in terms of atmospherics, visuals. Perhaps not that guy's eyeballs. I'm not sure what was going on there. Was that just the reflection in his glasses? Because that looked pretty creepy. I'm going to go back. I'm going to rewind that footage. Hang on, let me just find his eyeballs for you, because that was quite weird. I know it's Halloween and everything, but there's no need to be that scary. Yeah, I think it's the reflection, not his eyeballs poking out of his glasses. Next up, I tried a Radeon 7970, a 3GB card that can also be found for less than £30. At CEX, you can find it for £25, and the DD edition, is that double dissipation, for £32 currently at the time of this video, and you can run the game basically on the same settings. Now I thought it would run a bit better because the 7970 was a high-end card, a bit older than the 960, which is more of a mid-range offering, but the 7970 is no longer supported in terms of drivers, so we're working with drivers that date back a while now. As you can see here, still running with at least 60 frames per second in and around Armadillo here. Let's just, hold on, let's just get off the horse and cause some mischief, see if the frame rate holds up. Do you know what, the details as well, some of the things you see I have not noticed before. Oh look, 2 coffins there that represent where our graphics card should be. One for the 960 and one for the 7970. Lovely. Yeah, there are a few details I never noticed, like on my first or second playthrough. Like there's a guy here playing fetch with his dog, and I've never noticed that. I never noticed it on PS3, 360. I can't imagine it's been added in since then, but it's just a really intriguing detail, and it's another one of those things that makes the world feel a bit more alive as well. I think this is something that a lot of modern games still lack. Attention to detail in Rockstar titles is often really good, in my opinion. Visually, that dog doesn't look too good, but 2010, so can't complain too much. The textures are a bit odd, but yeah. It's an older game, alright, it's getting on. Now, with the 960 we actually had access to FSR3, but that is not an option here, so we can't use that. As you can see, we have FXAA, or basically off. I thought that was worth mentioning. FSR3 available on the 960, but not the 7970. For my next trick, I used an i5-8400 with nothing but the UHD 630 graphics. A i5-8400 will run you less than £30 here in the UK, so essentially we've got the CPU and the GPU for less than the cost of the game now. As you can see, it can't quite hit 30 frames per second at 1080p. I actually ran through a few different settings, whether it was dynamic res off, dynamic res on, something we still have access to. We also have access to FSR3 with the UHD 630 graphics, interestingly, as well. I did try this with an older chip. I fired up the i3-4170, which is a 4th gen part, of course, and uses HD 4400 graphics, but it wouldn't start. We had some sort of critical error, and I think you're going to get that with anything basically below the 5th gen. There are a couple of 5th gen chips, chips that don't support DX12 for the iGPU. So yeah, but I was messing around with the settings here, back on subject with the UHD 630, and nothing I could find could actually make this smooth, whether we set the dynamic res to target 60 FPS, 30 FPS or higher, and we drop the resolution scale slider even lower than that. It just wasn't happening for this one, but I'll show you what I did to actually get this running smoothly on UHD 630 graphics, along with this pretty old 6-core i5-8400. We can actually drop the game to 320 by 240, perhaps even lower. 320 by 200 maybe. I think that's to do with the Intel drivers, though. Not sure if this would be an option usually, but it's interesting that it's there. Luckily we don't have to resort quite to that as of yet. I actually ended up going with lowest settings across the board, everything set to its respective lowest. Motion blur off once again, 800 by 600 for at least 30 frames per second. It does not look all that good visually. It doesn't look too different from higher presets, but the resolution is rather off-putting. At least we can also make use of FXAA though. Now, this sort of works the opposite way round. From what I've experienced so far, I'm getting lower frame rates outside of town, and then things start to pick up. As you can see, we're making our way to Armadillo here, and the frame rate is getting slowly, or getting gradually higher and higher, which isn't what I was anticipating, and it didn't work like that with the other tests. If anything, the town was more demanding beforehand. So let's see if we can switch to 720p. Yeah, I switched to 720p. Low settings, FXAA. This reminds me of how it used to look on the PS3 back in the day. Probably a bit better on the console. I don't think it was quite running at low settings, but I think it was running at 1280 by 720, maybe a bit lower, I can't quite remember. But I turned it up again, and in and around town, we're seeing at least 30 frames per second, close to 40. In fact, sorry fellas to interrupt your drunken conversation here, but I'm trying to make a benchmarking video here. Yeah, I mean, there are a few little dips and drops. The i5-8400 with nothing but the UHD 630 is, however, running Red Dead Redemption 1 with more than 30 FPS at a cost of less than the game. Steady on, Halsey. Wasn't quite expecting this performance. I know it is an older game and all, but I was wondering whether or not it would run smoothly, and safe to say it does. As you can see here, making our way outside of town though, and it drops a little below 30, but nothing too concerning. Well worth a try. If you've never played this before, you have to ask yourself, is it worth the money? If you can find it on like PS3 or Xbox 360, you've still got an older console, it's worth playing on those still. And if you have a PS4, was it Xbox One as well? It came to. I definitely recommend checking it out there if you can get it cheaper than on PC. But we do get the higher frame rate limit on PC, as well as a couple of other features as well, like FSR3, so that's worth bearing in mind. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to sit here and tell you to spend your money on it. It's something you have to make your mind up for yourselves. But hopefully this helps you understand the performance a bit more, which is very good. It's going to run really well on a wide range of hardware, providing it's relatively modern, sort of within the last 10 years, I'm going to have to say. But that's all for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.